Michael, this does sound a little mind-boggling. All these issues hitting listeners at once, and if they've just come across this neoliberal privatisation of the earth, can you explain the role of resource scarcity, or scarcity itself, and how that flows through to various licensing or control of natural resources, aka the planet?
Well, all classical economic theory, from the physiocrats through Adam Smith, through John Stuart Mill, through Marx and Henry George, was basically a theory of value and price. Price was defined as the excess of market prices, what people pay, over the cost of production, including normal profits. So the idea was that as resources become scarce, whether it's land or minerals, the difference will be economic rent over and above the actual cost of production. And John Stuart Mill defined this as what we'd call a free lunch. He said economic rent is what landlords make in their sleep, without working, without enterprise of their own, simply by the rise in what they can charge over the cost of production. Well, land has no cost of production because it's supplied freely by nature. Minerals and subsoil wealth have no cost of production, and monopoly rents, price gouging has no cost of production, except that needed to bribe the legislatures, which is euphemized as financing their campaign contributions. So that you have monopoly rights, land rights, and interest is a monopoly right. It's the right of banks to create credit, which they can create freely today on a computer keyboard at minimal cost, and create interest-bearing debt. So all of these forms of what the classical economists called economic rent are added on to the actual cost of production to become prices that users of land must pay, homeowners must pay, commercial property developers must pay, industry must pay for minerals, and all of this, there's an increasing price of minerals relative to the cost of production, just as there's an increasing price of land relative to its cost of production, namely zero. So the economy has turned from a industrial economy into a rentier economy. Now, the political program of classical economics was actually reformist, and the great struggle of classical economics for 200 years, from the 18th to 19th century, from the French physiocrats that led to the French Revolution, through the 19th century progressive era reform, to the social democratic parties in Europe and the progressive parties in the United States, were all aimed economically to bring prices down to the cost of production so that there wouldn't be any free lunch, so that there wouldn't be any excess of price over value. And in the United States, as I mentioned, that was set up by antitrust regulation and price regulation. Today, the financial sector has gradually gained such power over the industrial sector and the real economy that it's been able to neutralize and dismantle the regulatory systems by putting deregulators in place in the United States, or simply not having any regulation at all in the privatized economies that begin to sell off the public domain.
Michael, is there a way the Western economies can reindustrialize?
Well, that would be primarily by taking the classical economic policy that said that the tax system, government revenues, the fiscal resources should be based on this economic rent that's provided freely by nature. When you have a land tax, for instance, you leave less income to be capitalized into an interest-bearing bank loan. So in the United States, the motto of real estate investors such as Donald Trump and others is that rent is for paying interest. If the government collects this rental value, then it's not available to be paid out as interest. And that the result is to hold down the price of housing so that people will pay only the cost of construction and capital improvements on the land, not on the land itself. The land rent would be the natural tax base instead of taxing people. Same thing for public utilities. The idea is that public utility rent, the government would operate most of the natural monopolies. Once you privatize these natural monopolies, you add on costs that the public sector doesn't have. You add on interest charges, for instance, that the public sector doesn't have because it's financed the construction out of tax revenue. You add exorbitant executive salaries that the public sector doesn't permit. And in fact, the CEOs, chief officers and managers of privatized utilities make much more than the Prime Minister or the President of the United States. They pay themselves. And they also pay the investment banks money to go private and get the capital gains for private investors rather than leaving the public sector with capital gains with the increase in value that prosperity itself creates and is not created by the owners of these property rights. So essentially you become a property right economy and a rentier economy instead of an industrial economy. Well, this is the opposite of what 19th century people thought. All of the economists in the 19th century expected the financial system to become industrialized, to become the service of industry, and to make loans to industry to put in place new means of production. And this was done especially in Germany and in Central Europe. All of this was changed by World War I, which was really the great watershed in history. When England and the United States won, that was construed as a victory of the Anglo-American banking system based on real estate loans and loans against collateral instead of the Central European industrial banking system. And since World War I, there's hardly been any industrial banking anywhere. Most capital investment in the United States, Australia, and other countries is made out of the retained earnings of corporations already in place, plus initial public offerings for new capital investment. It's not financed by the banks, and the privatized banking system here has become basically predatory and extractive rather than productive. The classical economists define productive loans as loans which enabled the borrower to put in place the means of repaying the debt and its interest charges. Today, the only kind of loan that does that are loans in the context of a real estate bubble, where a loan to a borrower will repay out of asset price inflation with a higher indebtedness charge, rather than loans to industries to increase the production and raise living standards. And that's why a real estate bubble doesn't raise living standards, it eats into it. And that's the result of untaxing real estate and property, and especially untaxing land and shifting the tax onto labor and industry.
So you've been here now 5 or 6 days. What are you seeing in the facts and figures of the Australian economy? How are our foundations standing up? We're supposed to have defined global economic gravity. What do you foresee?
Well, gravity is a force of nature, so no economy can defy economic gravity any more than an airplane can defy gravity. An airplane doesn't defy gravity, it counteracts it by the power, and the power that seems to have defied gravity, or counteracted it rather, is the growth in debt. Australians have been living on debt, and now that the property prices have reached their limit in many areas for commercial property and for personal homes, banks have stopped lending. And this decline in debt finds its counterpart in a rise in saving. Now, the rise in saving doesn't result from more prosperity for Australians. The rise in saving comes from homeowners unable to borrow more against their homes, but are repaying their debt. And the amortization of a debt is counted in the national income statistics as a negation of a negation, and therefore an increase in the savings rate.
So you've seen that there's actually a reduction in loans going on?
Yes, the statistics show that the volume of debt is falling back relative to national income, and saving is rising. But the saving doesn't mean that people are getting more prosperous, as Keynes thought in the 1930s. It means that people are getting more debt-strapped and are unable to borrow more to get by, and they're having to repay their mortgages and the other debts. Credit card debts, I'm told, are 13% here. That's very high, and this leaves them with less and less revenue available to spend on goods and services. So Australia is entering the period of debt deflation and shrinking markets.
Professor Michael Hudson, thank you very much for talking to us. We look forward to continuing on this discussion perhaps next week on The Renegade Economist.
Thank you very much, Carol.